A suicide destroys what appears to be a perfect marriage.
They seem to be so happy with each other.
Tragedy is quickly replaced by mystery and bizarre behavior.
They're French kissing in the morgue. If it weren't so tragic, it would be comical.
Had investigators exposed a deadly cover-up?
You've got sex, you got drugs, you got death. I think that's 3 of the 4 media food groups, isn't it?
The U.S.-Mexico border near Tijuana. In February 1995, Kristen Rossum and Greg DeVillers, complete strangers, meet on the pedestrian bridge.
I mean, literally, they bump into each other.
Kristen is alone, so Greg and his brothers ask her to spend the day with them south of the border.
It was a match made in Tijuana. You've got this 18-year-old woman, hazel-eyed, blonde-haired. She's a beauty. And these guys, the DeVillers brothers, they're nice guys. They're honest. They're compassionate. So she hangs out with them for the rest of the night, goes home with them, and never leaves Greg.
Within days, Kristen moves into Greg's San Diego apartment. Both are students at local colleges, a bright future seemingly assured.
He had plans, he had goals, and he was thrilled for the goals that she had, and he worked hard. He was very excited about her. He was very proud of her, and she was very proud of him.
2 years later, Greg graduates and begins his career at a biotech company. Kristen gets a part-time job at an unusual place, the San Diego Medical Examiner's office. By the end of the year, they're engaged.
She seemed to always be looking up at him with these big eyes.
In 1999, they get married.
Gregory, will you have this woman to be your wife?
The other boys always looked up to him. He was the nicest, the kindest, just a kid with a real big heart.
Kristen is the most wonderful person I've ever met. She's incredible in so many ways.
We were real confident that they seemed to be so happy with each other.
So kind and caring and sharing. And I just can't wait to just spend the rest of my life with her.
After the wedding, the young couple settle in an apartment on the campus of the University of California, San Diego. Kristen graduates cum laude and gets a full-time job as a toxicologist at the medical examiner's office. And Greg's biotech career is taking off.
They appeared to be like most young couples in love, looking forward to a new life together.
For all outward appearances, the young couple seems to have it all. But on November 6th, 2000, everything changes.
911 emergency.
Yes, my husband is not breathing.
Okay, is he there with you at 8150, apartment 204?
Yes, he is. He's in bed. He's cold.
The caller is 24-year-old Kristen Rossum.
Oh, my God.
She tells the dispatcher that Greg may have taken drugs to kill himself.
Okay, try to get him off the bed and onto the floor right now, okay? And I'll work with you, okay?
Oh, God. I'm trying. He's on the floor.
Now listen to me, okay? I want you to put your ear next to his mouth and see if you can feel or hear any breathing, or if you can see his chest rise, do that now.
No.
He's not breathing? Okay, I'm going to tell you how to give mouth to mouth, okay? And we're going to do this until help comes and takes over, okay?
The dispatcher gives Kristen instructions on how to perform CPR.
Okay, 2 more breaths. Pump his chest 15 more times. Okay, 2 more breaths. You're doing fine.
But there's nothing the paramedics can do. They rush him to a nearby hospital. At 10:16 p.m., an hour after Kristen Rossum called 911, Greg DeVillers is declared dead, the victim, it seems, of a tragic suicide. Campus police officer Bob Jones is assigned to the case.
I arrived at about 11:30 on November the 6th, the year 2000. I arrived, Mr. DeVillers had already been removed to the hospital. His wife was at the hospital. What I found was an empty apartment with the exception of 3 officers. It was related to me that this was an apparent suicide.
Jones looks around the small apartment and makes a curious discovery in the bedroom.
On the right side, as you're looking at the bed, on the floor, was sprinkled numerous what appeared to be rose petals.
But if this was an overdose, Jones quickly realized something was missing.
We were unable to find a source container. Where was the source container for the substance that was used? Then about midnight, Kristen Rossum arrived at the apartment.
Jones notices that there was someone with her.
She just introduced him as a coworker. I did know him maybe about a 25-minute interview. She told me that he had taken some pills that she thought that she had thrown away years ago.
Why, Jones asks, would Greg want to kill himself?
She told me that recently they'd been going through some marital problems, marital issues, and that he was depressed over that.
When Jones asks about the rose petals, Kristen gives her theory. They are Greg's version of a suicide note.
A dramatic last gesture, I love you, I can't live without you.
Rossum says that she came home at about 8:30 that evening.
She found her husband sleeping. She didn't want to disturb him, so she decided to have something to eat. And then she took a long, and I emphasize the word long because that's the word she used, a long bath.
After the interview, Jones inspects the tub.
And I noticed that there was no stopper in the drain.
He finds it on a nearby shelf.
This is the type that you actually have to screw in and screw out. It makes no sense that you would take a long bath in the absence of a stopper. I found that odd that she had taken the time, had she taken a bath, to unscrew that stopper.
Jones isn't sure what to make of Greg DeVillers' death, but his instincts tell him there's more to the story.
I didn't have the whole picture yet. There were a number of pieces missing. Just a lot of things still needed to be done for me to conclude that this was indeed a suicide.
Two days after Greg DeVillers died of an apparent overdose, blood tests reveal the presence of 2 powerful drugs in his system. The first is the painkiller oxycodone. The second is a sedative called clonazepam. Finding this deadly combination of drugs seems to corroborate Kristen's story that her husband had OD'd on pills that she thought had been thrown out. But people close to Greg have a hard time believing he would swallow a handful of pills under any circumstance.
I can recall so many times he wouldn't even hardly take a Tylenol or a cold or something for an allergy. He just didn't do that.
He was so afraid of drugs in general that I've actually never seen him taking a pill, not even a headache pill. He was pretty health conscious. I never had the impression he's depressed or anything. He was a normal guy.
He was making plans for the boys to go on a fishing trip. The boys meaning his brothers and him.
This is the guy who is excited because the water's cold and the fishing is going to be good off the California coast. He's looking forward to going fishing. He's not suicidal.
So a lot of questions really weren't answered yet, and the longer this thing went on, the more questions came up.
Police aren't the only ones looking for answers.
And it just so happened that...
As news of the mysterious suicide breaks, investigative journalist Kevin Cox does his own search into Kristen Rossum's background.
These are people of wealth, of power, of prominence. Ralph Rossum was in the Reagan Justice Administration. He's a professor of constitutional law. Constance Rossum is a former high-powered ad executive.
Kristen was an accomplished child model and ballerina.
This is a woman that danced so well so as to actually move a professional out of the role of the Sugar Plum Fairy in the Nutcracker. So apparently she did have some talent.
But the picture-perfect girl had a dark side. In high school, she got into drugs and developed an insatiable appetite for methamphetamines or speed. There were frequent arguments, problems at school, a feigned suicide attempt.
They call them hesitation marks, these little scratches on your wrists when you don't really want to bleed out.
By the time Rossum reached the U.S.-Mexican border on that day early in 1995, her life was in a tailspin. She had dropped out of school and run away from her parents.
This woman didn't have any place to go. And this good man, this wholesome guy, wanted to take care of her.
Rossum moved into the apartment Greg shared with his brother Jerome. Almost right away, there was trouble.
Things started turning up missing.
There was some jewelry missing, family jewelry.
And Jerome couldn't find some checks.
And he had asked Kristen if she had taken them. No. Anyway, he did find them in Kristen's purse. And that bothered Jerome a lot, and he didn't trust her.
Like many addicts, Kristen started stealing to support her habit.
It gets so bad that Jerome DeVillers at one point moves out of the UCSD apartment. He's gone.
But Greg stood by Kristen and even tried to help her.
Greg absolutely did not like drugs, but he must have seen something in this girl. And he helped her get off of these drugs.
His brothers kidded him about Kristen being the obsession of his life. And that's what she was.
But was he obsessed enough to do himself in? Several days after Greg's death, while investigators are looking for leads, his brothers Jerome and Bert meet with Greg's boss.
I said, something is not right in this case. I can just not believe this is suicide because it doesn't make sense. And then his brother, Jerome, started to cry. And he said, I have exactly the same suspicion, so we should talk.
Jerome didn't let up. Jerome kept track of everything that he did. He kept track of the meetings that he had with people.
Jerome DeVillers started putting a little tape recorder in his pocket.
The brothers then confront Kristen, and the tape recorder is rolling.
I'm not trying to blame anybody. We're just looking for something to make sense.
It's hard for me to believe that my brother committed suicide.
I don't think he did. I don't think he did.
I don't think so either.
I think it was accidental. I don't know if he had a reaction to something. Maybe he's allergic to a drug. Maybe he just... Well, I don't know. We don't know, and we won't know until the results are back.
Kristen had told police the marriage had soured. The brothers want to know what happened.
I sat him down and I said, look, I'm sorry. I'm feeling very unhappy. I know this because I met someone who isn't make me happy.
That person, Kristen says, is her boss, Dr. Michael Robertson, an Australian native and a married man. But Kristen denies having an affair. Detective Jones realizes that Robertson is the same man he'd seen with Rossum on the night DeVillers died.
That not only set off bells, but that set off rockets for me. I mean, not only did it now look like it was probably something other than a suicide, but now we had a possible motive for a murder.
2 days after Greg DeVillers' apparent suicide, San Diego homicide detective Lori Agnew gets a call.
Somebody's like, this guy's talking about that his brother may have been murdered and it's being ruled as suicide. Could you talk to him?
Jerome DeVillers tells Agnew about his brother's suspicious death.
He says, my brother's not suicidal, he doesn't take drugs. And he goes on and on and on. He says, Kristen, his wife, is having an affair with her boss and her lover, Michael Robertson. He says, they do the autopsy, they test the, specimens. this is a real good way to cover something up. He says, we need somebody to look into it. So I said, okay, let me see what I can find out.
Agnew begins her own investigation and discovers that on the night Greg died, Rossum and her boss had a startling encounter at the morgue.
They allow Miss Rossum to go in with the body, and she comes out, and Dr. Robertson is there. The staff, a few people from the staff, see them embrace and kiss, and they thought this is a very strange thing. They thought it was more than just a comforting hug and kiss.
Michael Robertson and Kristen Rossum are exchanging a passionate kiss when Greg DeVillers isn't even cold yet. They're French kissing in the morgue.
Agnew continues to learn more details from Jerome DeVillers, who found out that Kristen had donated some of Greg's organs the night he died. DeVillers immediately called Stefan Grunwald.
I said, so which organs? And he said, oh, the skin and the eyes. And that made me very suspicious.
In an autopsy, the skin can show needle marks or other signs of drug use, and the fluid in the eyes can indicate what substances were ingested and when. Then, Grunwald learns that Kristen had arranged for the rest of Greg's body to be cremated immediately after the autopsy.
That sent off flags, okay? So I called the family. I said, we have to stop that from happening.
What also happens on that day is the DeVillers call us and say, we would like an independent autopsy.
The family also demands more extensive toxicological tests on Greg.
If they had done them in-house, obviously Rossum would not have done the work on her husband, so the person that would have come in and done the test would have been her boss and her lover, Michael Robertson. So they end up shipping them to some private labs.
The new tests confirm the presence of clonazepam and oxycodone in Greg's system.
The levels of clonazepam and oxycodone were enough to put him into a coma.
But those two drugs, it appears, are not what killed him. Toxicologists find something even deadlier in his bloodstream, a painkiller called fentanyl.
Fentanyl is fast-acting. It's a drug that is used in combination with other drugs in a surgical setting.
The narcotic, rarely used outside of hospitals, is 100 times stronger than morphine.
The amount that was in him was enough to kill probably everybody on this floor.
But because fentanyl isn't part of a routine drug screening, it would have never been picked up at the medical examiner's office. Had investigators exposed a deadly cover-up?
When Michael Robertson found out that those toxicological tests were going outside San Diego County, there was some visible shock.
Dr. Robertson did know that if somebody dies from multiple drugs, and fentanyl is one of those, it's not going to get picked up at the San Diego Medical Examiner's office because they're not testing for it.
And Kristen Rossum knew that San Diego County routinely did not test for fentanyl.
We start having to look at the medical examiner's office because now, where did the fentanyl come from?
Agnew orders a search warrant on the medical examiner's office, where Rossum and Robertson work.
We want to see all their records of all the drugs that they had impounded over the last couple of years. And there were hundreds and hundreds of drugs that had been impounded.
In the meantime, Agnew questions Michael Robertson.
Kristen and I became fond of each other shortly after I began working at the lab. We had a personal relationship probably a month after I began there.
He is very careful in choosing his words on how he talks to us, and he also denies any kind of a relationship with Rossum. We ask him about his knowledge of fentanyl, about had he worked any fentanyl cases, had he done any fentanyl testing, and everything is no, 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 no.
Investigators search the medical examiner's office and find some astonishing clues. In a desk, they discover a crumpled up envelope from the drug impound room and a crack pipe with some residue on it.
One of the things we do is we do DNA off of the pipe. And it comes back with Rossum's DNA on that pipe. It also tests positive for meth.
Then, a huge break in the case. They find an empty vial of fentanyl, the drug that killed Greg.
It's a very small vial, but it doesn't take very much of that to cause a fatality. And that vial is there, but the drug is missing.
Also missing are oxycodone and clonazepam, the two other drugs found in his system.
Out of all those drugs, there were only oxycodone, clonazepam, fentanyl, and meth. Those are the only drugs that were missing. All the drugs that are taken are in our victim or in our suspect.
And who was in charge of the drug inventory logbook? None other than Kristen Rossum herself.
Imagine, the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office puts a known meth user in charge of the logbook for the drug locker. And they put her lover in charge of her. If it weren't so tragic, it would be comical.
Detectives are now convinced that Greg DeVillers did not die by suicide. They open a full-blown homicide investigation.
I knew I was looking at a murder.
They were on to the clever plot. But could investigators find enough evidence to arrest Rossum? In early December 2000, as the investigation into her husband Greg DeVillers' mysterious death continues, Kristen Rossum is fired from her job at the medical examiner's office.
She had lied about her past drug usage, current drug usage, and her affair with Robertson.
Michael Robertson is also fired.
The big reason is he found out about her current drug usage and didn't report it. He covered it up.
Greg's death is now a murder investigation, and Rossum and Robertson top the suspect list.
I call Miss Rossum and ask her to come in for an interview.
Kristen? Hi, I'm Lori Agnew. Hi. You've met Detective Valle? Jim, call me Jim.
Detective Jimmy Valle and I brought her in, did an interview with her that lasted a good couple, 3 hours.
I just want you to know that you're here at Bell Accord. You can, if you feel comfortable and you want to leave, you can leave. This is not...
Agnew first asks Rossum what had soured her brief marriage.
I was feeling suffocated by him. Because although there became a point where I didn't need his constant clinging, it got to the point where and I spoke with my mom about this in great detail, and she said, you know what, you always have a separation.
Then Rossum is asked about her boss, Michael Robertson.
He seemed to have all the qualities that I felt Greg was lacking. And we just became very good friends. We had a lot in common and developed a very close relationship.
Rossum claims that Greg was so desperately in love with her that when she told him about the relationship with Robertson, he killed himself. Then Rossum is asked about her drug use.
This doesn't happen. I relapsed. But I'm working with a counselor on that.
You're being candid with me.
I'm doing my best. I don't want to... I'm just trying to... I need to heal.
And what have you slipped into? What did you take?
She was exceptionally thin. She sat pretty much cross-legged, just kind of bouncing around quite a bit, couldn't sit still. I'm looking at her and saying, we have somebody that's strung out here.
And what about the bizarre circumstance of rose petals found near Greg's body? Kristen had told some friends that his final gesture was an ode to her favorite movie, American Beauty.
Where did that flower come from? Was that a flower that he had presented to you?
It had just been my birthday, and he got me beautiful 18 roses.
Rossum's explanation for the rose petals was that he had given her a couple dozen red roses, and that she had thrown them all away except for about 4 of them that had still survived to that weekend.
They lasted for so long.
And when was your birthday prior to his death?
But the petals collected at the crime scene appeared to be fresh, and, to Agnew, Rossum's story seems odd on another level.
You know, women are dramatic. We might do something like that. But there's not too many guys that are going to do that, okay? It just seemed kind of ridiculous even to us at the onset.
Circumstantial evidence is heaped against Rossum and Robertson, but police still don't have enough hard evidence to prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Looking for more clues, they confiscate 17 computers, including Michael Robertson's laptop. The computers are turned over to the Regional Computer Forensic Laboratory in San Diego.
We're essentially a digital crime lab. We look at digital evidence. Data does not get deleted. It can get overwritten, but it really doesn't get deleted.
Petrocek spends nearly 1,000 hours going through all the hard drives.
We start getting information that shows a lot of communication between Rossum and Robertson, Rossum and her husband, and other people.
With Greg DeVillers, the victim, it was very clear he was very passionate about his job. And it was very clear also, from my perspective, that he was very passionate about his wife. And by the same token, his wife was very passionate about her boss at the medical examiner's office.
The search uncovers a trail of torrid messages between Rossum and Robertson.
These were people that spoke of this destiny, that spoke of soulmates, that spoke of heaven and earth and forces bringing them together.
Investigators also find over 36 documents in Robertson's files pertaining to fentanyl, the drug that killed Greg DeVillers.
It was a slide from a PowerPoint presentation that Robertson had in his portfolio of presentations on toxicology, talking about fentanyl patches that were missing from the medical examiner's office. And I sat back, I thought, oh my gosh.
Detectives learn that Robertson and Rossum attended a forensics conference in Milwaukee together.
And they hear a presentation on fentanyl and how it shows up in unintentional deaths and suicides.
They shared a room for the entire week.
A month before Greg DeVillers dies, his wife and her lover are at a toxicology conference in Milwaukee, and they're basically getting a blueprint about how to murder Greg DeVillers. And San Diego County paid for him to go.
Prosecutors now had a staggering amount of circumstantial evidence that told the story of a deadly plot. While investigators finally had enough evidence to arrest Kristen Rossum, her lover and former boss, Michael Robertson, remains uncharged and returns to Australia. Meanwhile, Kristen Rossum's bail is set at $1.25 million. She spends 6 months in jail before she's released in January 2002, when her parents pay the bond.
The charges are just not true. I did not harm my husband in any way, and I believe that'll come out in court.
I think it was all calculated. They marketed Kristen Rossum just like a McNugget. The pearls, the Mercedes.
It's hard not to be bitter that 6 months has been taken out of my life. I just look forward to the resolution of all of this and to the time when I can carry on with my life and my family with care.
As the trial date approaches, prosecutors piece together the timeline of a murder, beat by beat.
It was very clear to us from a number of things that happened that she just wasn't being truthful.
Investigators believe that Kristen spent months planning the perfect poisoning. On November 5th, she and Greg had a fight. The next day, he was dead.
He wanted me to quit my job. And he had given me basically an ultimatum. Which was, either you quit your job, or I will inform them of your drug history.
Greg's threat was the final straw for Rossum, prosecutors contend. She decided to get rid of him once and for all.
It's extremely calculated, cold, and vicious.
You got to get Greg DeVillers out of the way so you can keep using methamphetamine. You got to get Greg DeVillers out of the way so that you can have your love affair.
Prosecutors believe that on the morning of November 6th, Kristen put her plan into action.
So Monday morning, you guys get up.
I get up, he's still groggy, and I call him for it.
Yes, hi. This is Kristen, Greg's wife, calling. He's not feeling well at all today, so he's most likely going to be taking the whole day. He's sleeping right now, but I just wanted to let you know. Hopefully someone else gets this message and set up not being part of him. Okay, thank you. Bye.
In all the, let's see, 2.5 years he worked for me, almost 3 years he worked for me, he has not been a single time late without calling me.
Work calls the house several times during the course of that day and never get an answer.
I did my first phone call to him at his home at about 10-something.
Greg is lying in bed, supposedly all day. There is a phone next to his bed.
Literally couldn't be much closer to Greg's head unless it were on the bed next to his head.
By now, it was about 11:30 a.m., the same time that Rossum had claimed to be by her husband's side.
Thank you for lunch to make sure you would eat.
Did you have any conversation with him then? Was he awake?
He was awake. He got up. He was definitely better.
And then I called at lunchtime, again his home, and nobody picked up.
Rossum's account of that last day doesn't jibe with what investigators know about the victim.
And he came out, pushed around a little bit, and he told me, I said, what's going on? What'd you say?
Greg was somebody that didn't use drugs and did not like drugs, didn't want anything to do with drugs.
And he said that he took some old prescriptions that he hadn't thrown away. They were mine.
She had had some drugs, some oxycodone and some clonazepam, and Greg took them away from her, and he threw the prescription bottles away.
He said, we're getting rid of them. But they're away. I guess we never did.
Because, of course, there has to be an explanation in her story about how is it that he ended up with oxycodone and clonazepam in his system when he never used that stuff.
He said, there aren't any more. That's good. He's getting better. I mean, he was...
The prosecution contends that Rossum secretly drugged her husband. After the oxycodone and clonazepam put him into a coma, she administered the fatal dose of fentanyl.
We don't know how the fentanyl got into his system, but we know there was a boatload there.
He went back to bed, and I thought, okay, this is good. He just needs to rest.
Throughout the investigation, Rossum has maintained that Greg poisoned himself and that she didn't discover his body until later in the evening.
So you got home, and then you came in for dinner about, I think you said 5 or something? Or?
5:15 probably.
Okay. And he was asleep?
Yeah.
She leaves him a little note and says there's leftovers in the fridge. I'm going to go shopping.
And you went shopping, and you came home about what time?
8:30.
He's still asleep in bed. She goes in and takes a long bath.
Get ready for bed.
And climbs into bed and notices that Greg is cold. He's not breathing.
And I knew what I feared, and I mean, I just see people like that at work.
But yet again, the details don't add up. Investigators closely scrutinize the 911 call.
She calls 911 on a cordless phone.
Once the 911 call's made, remember that clock's ticking.
Okay, try to get him off the bed and onto the floor right now, okay?
The police are coming.
Oh, God.
It's a matter of time.
They get there, I think, in 3 minutes. So she's supposed to be doing CPR, and that's what you're hearing on the tape.
Pump his chest 15 more times.
I called 911 and I used CPR. That was so hard.
But when the paramedics arrived, they found Greg alone in the bedroom.
She's standing in another room, a good 20 feet away from the body.
She's not breathing heavy. If you listen to the phone call, she never did CPR on him.
Her breathing seemed throughout that phone call like it would if somebody was just right on the phone.
Did you give him 2 more breaths? Okay.
Not as if somebody was on the phone, then trying to give CPR to her husband, then coming back onto the phone.
Once again, the paramedics' report supports the prosecution's theory.
There was no redness on the chest, which is what they would expect to find if somebody was doing chest compressions and CPR.
Greg DeVillers was way dead.
They saw lividity, his lips were turning blue.
She made sure of it before she called 911.
And then there were the rose petals sprinkled on the floor around Greg's body.
There was something about there were rose petals.
Oh my God. She's trying to be melodramatic, I guess.
Her story was that when she got into bed and pulled back the covers when she realized he wasn't breathing, that there were rose petals and they went everywhere.
There's no rose petals on the bed. Now, if he really sprinkles the rose petals on himself, why aren't there at least 1 or 2 rose petals on the bed?
The death scene that she so carefully staged is all messed up.
Greg DeVillers was officially declared dead 1 hour after his wife called 911.
But we think he was out, and that he had been out since early in the morning. That's why he never answered the phone.
He had all the signs that he had been dead, and dead for a while.
Kristen Rossum filled her diary with mournful notes to her husband, beginning on the day after he died. The notion that she could ever hurt him seemed to appall her.
That's disgusting. That's horrible.
People do it.
Not me. Not that's ludicrous. I don't even know how to support that. I really don't. He was such a sweet and good man.
Prosecutors don't buy Rossum's story, but without a smoking gun, can they convince a jury that she's a calculating killer? By early October 2002, Kristen Rossum goes on trial in what's become a notorious and sensationalized story.
What more do the tabloids need than the American Beauty murder? I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up.
Me personally, I felt very good about the case. That being said, it was a circumstantial case. There was a large volume of information that this jury had to sort through.
Then, just a few days before jury selection, prosecutors discover a critical piece of evidence. At the time of her arrest, Rossum was carrying a discount card from Vaughn's grocery store.
Vaughn's keeps a record of every purchase that you make.
Investigators uncover a transaction that Rossum made on the afternoon her husband died.
What it showed was on November 6, 2000, at 12:41, the chicken soup was purchased, cold medication was purchased, and a single rose.
A rose that could have provided the fresh petals that were found near Greg DeVillers' body.
She obviously paid cash, but her mistake was she wanted the discount. So she swiped that Vaughn's card.
And that was a significant find. I mean, that was phenomenal. What it shows was the closest thing to a smoking gun.
The game was up.
Testimony in Kristen Rossum's trial begins in mid-October 2002.
It was a parade. It was as if she was going to a premiere. It was as if there was a red carpet outside the San Diego County Courthouse. She looks like a movie star, and I'm sure that was part of the plan. This couldn't be a woman that poisoned her husband.
But the prosecution presents the jury with a simple but effective reminder of who Kristen Rossum really is, a blow-up of her mugshot taken during the depths of her meth addiction.
We just wanted to let them know that you can't just look at her in court and think that's the way she is.
The mugshots tell a different story. That's the real Kristen Rossum. That's the killer.
The trial lasts just under a month. Over 50 witnesses testify, including Kristen Rossum herself.
She got to tell her story, and I think was shown repeatedly to be a liar.
It takes the jury just 7.5 hours of deliberation to find Kristen Rossum guilty of murdering Greg DeVillers. The verdict came on what would have been Greg's 29th birthday. Rossum's lover and alleged co-conspirator, Michael Robertson, remains in Australia.
They don't want to talk about that so much, but they were after Michael Robertson. They called him a suspect. They called him an unindicted co-conspirator.
The investigation of Michael Robertson is ongoing, and that's the only information that I can provide to you.
Kristen Rossum is sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. She takes her final walk on a city street just 3 years after walking down the aisle, the bride of Greg DeVillers, the pride and joy of her doting parents.
She is still the Sugar Plum Fairy to her parents. This was their little girl. This is how they chose to remember her.
She's evil. And I don't know how else to say it. I hate her for what she's done. She took my friend. She tortured him. And she had a chance to bring him back before that final dose of fentanyl.
I think this case is an example of exactly why criminal cases are such a team effort. It's just commitment to the truth and dedication by a number of different people that ultimately allowed us to present to the jury the full information that we could about what happened in this case and allowed them to determine the truth. This was a killing that didn't need to happen. There was no reason for it, and for that reason, it seems particularly cruel.
A crime of passion, people can understand that. This was over almost a 24-hour period. It took a while. That's pretty cold. That's a scary person that can do something like that.